we end up with this idea: how do we make every street in Sweden healthy, sustainable, and vibrant as in full of life? And that doesn't mean that every street has to be like Södermalm on a Friday night or the middle of Malmö on a Friday night. It can just be full of life in terms of butterflies and bees. That's also fine. That's a different kind of vibrancy. But clearly some of it should also be full of people. And healthy and sustainable. And then underneath that, we can then get into some quite technical questions. But the first question there means that then we're unlocking the idea of the street from just being about traffic. So not just having the input of, let's say, the trafikkontora into the street, and the output therefore being traffic, but actually multiple things heading into it. So this kind of fan that you see there has lots of different inputs going into it. Social justice, public health, climate resilience, all of those things can be inputs, and therefore they are the outputs as well. The outputs can be improved air quality, improved water quality, greater conviviality, better social fabric being built, and so on. So underneath that, there's an idea of what we call a value model that's emerging. And this is something that we want to build with all of you, actually, to understand how do you produce multiple values out of the street. Not just parking fees, which is one of the key outputs of the street at the moment, or traffic, but actually how does it change public health? How does it improve climate resilience? All of that research exists, but is often the case. It exists in silos. We want to bring them together into the street. So we start aligning the fact that you can use the street to increase children's social mobility alongside reduced maintenance costs by alleviating flooding, for instance. Exactly the same interventions, multiple outputs. There is a sort of a complex system underneath that in terms of interventions. Don't worry about this too much unless you really want to. We're happy to share all of this stuff later. But these are the kind of moves you might make and how they fit together as a system. I don't want to pretend that's too analytical, because to be honest, the point here is getting into the street and start working that through. And that's what we're doing this afternoon. So what we've been doing technically from a Vinnova point of view is seeing the mission as a container for multiple projects. Some of those existed already. Smarta Gator, which is a project that KTH were running with a few others. That's translated into Framtidsgator, which we're now aligning with Levandagator. So these are all existing projects that we're pulling together in this more coherent bundle of things. The mission is a kind of container for all those activities. If we unlock this in a different way, it's very powerful. Again, the streets in the city, if you look at this is Göteborg. We could look at the middle and a transformation project in the middle of Göteborg, like the River City project, which is enormous, one of the biggest in Europe. But at the same time, if we unlock all of the streets in Göteborg, that's in fact much bigger, far more diverse actually, because it gets into all kinds of different bits of the city. That's the image on the right-hand side. So the starting point is, how do we start making these small interventions in the street and start developing this work together? And so we're now looking at working with ArcDes. We've been doing this with ArcDes for 6 months now. Commissioning Lundberg Design to develop this idea of modular street furniture that can begin to work in the existing streets that you all have in cities. And think of this like a kit of parts, almost like IKEA components or Lego, if you like, that can have multiple applications. And you can start dropping those into cities right now, right into the streets right now. In fact, this is what it begins to look like. An extensible piece of kit is built out of Swedish timber, cross-laminate timber, in fact, made in Swedish factories, so we can customize it but manufacture it. I say we, I mean you. It extends to fit the streets that you have and can be multiple spaces. The first part we've done here is working with Stockholm Stad and building in around their existing summer streets programs, but developing that. And the first streets that we've been looking at are outside schools, in fact. So we had school children designing the streets outside their schools. And the first 4 streets are in Stockholm. I'll show you a picture in a moment. The first one is launching tomorrow, actually, the remodeled street. The kids made the input using the method that we'd come up with, a participative method. We've also had the Statsminister doing this. I won't tell you who was better, the kids or the Statsminister, but it was the kids. And this is the kind of output you get from kids designing the street. These are the streets they're going into first. They're sort of typical city centre streets, which you all have, which are largely devoted to hardscape for vehicle traffic, but there's not actually even that much traffic on them a lot of the time. So then they've been turned into plans with white architecture and spacescape in this case, and Stockholm Stad's planning department, Trafikkontoret. The elements look like this. They're kind of multiple components, different applications, scooter stands, beehives, e-commerce drop-off points, car-sharing elements, social spaces, tons of greenery, whatever you decide. The key thing here actually is whatever the citizens decide, because this is a kit that enables citizens to decide, the residents and users of the street, what happens in their street. But think of these physical elements a bit like a boardwalk then in that case. They can kind of curve in and around the existing streets. They can extend or contract. They can go in and enable people to start walking in spaces where you don't usually walk. So it has this kind of feeling of that. Also, boardwalks are all year round. They work in the wet, they work in the snow. We have to make that work. So this is the timber turning up at the factory for the first prototypes. You don't worry about reading all of that. That just says that all of the partners here stack up across different models to make this scale. So we're not just making one thing happen in those 4 streets in Stockholm. Increasingly, we want to work with all of you, and we want you to see this as your project, actually. But just to say that what we can do as Vinnova and Viable Cities is help coordinate behind that, fund the design and research in the first prototypes, but not the full thing. But we align, then the other myndighets are involved. We align Transportstyrelsen, they're involved. We align some private sector companies like Voi and Volvo M and others who are all contributing their inputs into that as well. And that's basically where we end up. So who decides in the end? The street decides, and they adopt it and adapt it. This kit should be an ongoing library, like an open source library. And it really asks some really super interesting questions, which I'll leave you with. This is a lovely project by Linda Tegg, the Australian artist at Arcdes in Stockholm at the moment, and it's called Infield, and it's based on Swedish infields, the meadows next to the farms. And she's asking the question about what is vegetation in the city? Can it be this kind of modular, much more exploratory environment, not just a plant in a box, but actually more like a meadow? Of course, right now there's politics in here as well. There's this great quote from Nikita Oliver, the mayoral candidate in Seattle, about Black Lives Matter. Who decides what the street is about? That has to be done with the community. So the last thought I'd said is this kind of, what we're talking about here is not just the 15-minute city, but the 1-minute city. The city outside your front door, the citizens' city outside the front door there. What's around them immediately, that's something that they can share a lot more of the decision-making around. Our job is to design the conditions that enable them to do that, to have that shared ownership of the city, true participation in that sense. So the street mission is not the only mission, but it's a good one to start with. We can align multiple existing projects in that way, and it enables us to start testing this much more shared and systemic and place-based way of working. And Viable Cities is the vehicle to help drive this forward. At that point, I'll leave it and hand back to Åsa.